Rich man mocks orphan boy's letter. What happens next leaves him in tears. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the grand, ornate windows of Grayson Manor, casting streaks of gold across the marble floors. Edmund Grayson, a man of power and wealth, sat behind a polished mahogany desk in his study. His sharply tailored suit and neatly combed hair were a testament to his precision and control over every detail of his life. He was a man who had built an empire with ruthless efficiency, his name synonymous with wealth and success. Yet, as he sat there scanning the latest financial reports, his expression was cold and detached. To him, life was a game of numbers and leverage. Emotions had no place in it. Outside the iron gates of the mansion, a very different life played out. On the cobblestone streets of the city, young Charlie darted between passers-by, clutching a piece of folded paper close to his chest. His clothes were patched and threadbare, his shoes scuffed and barely holding together. Yet his face shone with determination. He'd spent the better part of the night writing the letter, carefully choosing every word despite his limited education. To Charlie, this letter wasn't just ink on paper, it was hope. Charlie finally reached the towering gates of Grayson Manor. He looked up, craning his neck to take in the grandeur of the place. The mansion loomed above him, a stark contrast to the crumbling orphanage he called home. His heart pounded as he slipped through a gap in the gate and hurried toward the main door. He had been warned to stay away from this part of the city. Rich men like Grayson don't have time for boys like you, the orphanage caretaker had said. But Charlie refused to believe that. If he could just deliver the letter, he was sure Mr. Grayson would listen. At the front door, a sharp knock echoed through the grand hall. Moments later, a butler appeared, his expression stern as he looked down at the boy. "You shouldn't be here," the butler said curtly. "This is private property." "Please," Charlie said, holding up the folded letter. "I need to give this to Mr. Grayson. It's important." The butler hesitated, his eyes softening slightly as he took in the boy's earnest expression. "Wait here," he said finally, taking the letter and disappearing inside. Inside the study, Grayson was in the middle of a meeting with his board members when the butler entered, holding the folded piece of paper. "Sir," the butler said, his tone cautious, "a young boy came to the door with this. He insisted it was important." Grayson frowned, taking the letter without much interest. "A boy?" he muttered, unfolding the paper. His eyes skimmed the messy handwriting, his brow furrowing. Then, to the surprise of everyone in the room, he chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made the butler shift uncomfortably. "Listen to this," Grayson said, holding the letter up like it was a piece of entertainment. "Dear Mr. Grayson, my name is Charlie, and I live at the orphanage on Willow Street. We don't have much, but we have big dreams. My friends and I believe that with your help, we could fix the roof, get new books, and even start a soccer team. You're the richest man in town, so I thought maybe you could spare a little to help kids like us. Thank you for reading this. Sincerely, Charlie." The room erupted into laughter, some of the board members shaking their heads in disbelief. "The audacity," one of them said, smirking. "Doesn't the boy know Mr. Grayson is busy running an empire?" Grayson smirked, tossing the letter onto his desk like it was nothing. "Exactly. I don't have time for these childish fantasies." Unbeknownst to them, Charlie had managed to slip into the house, lingering just outside the study. He had heard every word. Charlie stepped into the room, his small frame trembling but his eyes blazing with defiance. "It's not a fantasy," he said, his voice loud enough to silence the laughter. "It's my life." The room fell silent as everyone turned to stare at the boy. Grayson's smirk faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "Who let you in here?" he demanded. "I let myself in," Charlie said, his chin held high. "I heard what you said about my letter. Maybe you think it's funny, but it's not. The kids at the orphanage, my friends, they're depending on me. On you." Grayson stood, towering over the boy. "And what makes you think I owe you anything? Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to get where I am?" Charlie didn't flinch. "I know you're rich and I know you have more than enough to help. You don't owe me anything, but you could still choose to do the right thing." For a brief moment, Grayson was at a loss for words. The boy's boldness caught him off guard. But then his irritation returned, sharper than before. "Get out," he said coldly. And don't come back. Charlie's eyes filled with tears, but he refused to let them fall. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his small figure disappearing down the grand hallway. That night, Grayson sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of scotch. The letter lay on the desk, crumpled but not discarded. He picked it up, smoothing it out with a sigh. As much as he wanted to dismiss the boy's words, they lingered in his mind, clawing at the edges of his carefully constructed indifference. "Big dreams," he muttered, rereading the letter. The phrase tugged at something deep within him, a memory he had long buried. Grayson had grown up in a different world, one far removed from the wealth he now enjoyed. His childhood had been defined by struggle and scarcity, his family scraping by in a tiny apartment above a factory. He had vowed at a young age to never be poor again, and that vow had driven him to build his empire. But in the process, he had lost touch with the part of himself that had once dreamed of something more. He shook his head, trying to push the memories away. "It's just a letter," he told himself, "a child's naive request. Nothing more." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. The next day, Grayson found himself walking down Willow Street, his driver trailing behind in the car. The orphanage was easy to spot, a crumbling building with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. Children played in the yard, their laughter echoing despite the dire conditions. Grayson paused at the gate, his hand resting on the iron bars. He watched as Charlie helped a younger boy tie his shoelaces, his movements patient and kind. A pang of something unfamiliar, was it guilt? Pricked at Grayson's chest. "Sir," the driver asked, stepping forward. "Shall I wait here?" Grayson nodded, his gaze still fixed on the children. "Yes. I won't be long." He walked through the gate and approached the yard, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. The children stopped playing, their laughter fading as they turned to stare at the stranger in the fine suit. Charlie looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Grayson hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I wanted to see the orphanage." Charlie narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious. "Why?" Grayson sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "Because of your letter. You said you have big dreams. I wanted to see them for myself." Charlie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, follow me." Charlie led Grayson into the orphanage, his small hand resting on the doorframe as he pushed it open. The creaking hinges echoed through the dimly lit hallway. The air inside was heavy with the scent of damp wood and the faint aroma of soup simmering somewhere in the distance. Grayson's polished shoes clicked against the scuffed floorboards, each step feeling louder than it should. "This is the dining hall," Charlie said, motioning to a room with long, mismatched tables and rickety chairs. A handful of children sat quietly, eating from chipped bowls. Their faces lit up when they saw Charlie, some waving and others calling out to him. "Charlie, did you bring us anything?" a younger boy asked, his wide eyes filled with hope. "Not today, Robbie," Charlie said gently, ruffling the boy's hair. "But soon. I promise." Grayson observed the interaction, his eyes narrowing slightly. "They seem to look up to you," he said. Charlie shrugged. "Someone has to look out for them." They continued through the orphanage, passing rooms with peeling wallpaper and sparse furnishings. In one corner, a group of children huddled around a makeshift pile of books, reading aloud to each other. Grayson noticed how tattered their clothes were, how the soles of their shoes were worn thin. The contrast to his own world was stark. "And this," Charlie said, stopping in front of a door that barely hung on its hinges, "is the room where the roof leaks the most. When it rains, we have to use buckets to catch the water." Grayson stepped inside, his eyes scanning the stained ceiling and the puddles on the floor. He frowned, the weight of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. "How long has it been like this?" Charlie tilted his head, thinking. "Since I can remember. The caretaker tries her best, but we don't have much money. That's why I wrote to you." The words hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. Grayson looked at Charlie, the boy's earnest gaze piercing through his usual defenses. He opened his mouth to speak but was interrupted by a voice behind him. "Charlie, who is this?" a woman asked, stepping into the room. She was middle-aged, her face lined with years of worry and effort, but her eyes were warm. "This is Mr. Grayson," Charlie said. "The one I told you about." The woman's expression flickered with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Mr. Grayson," she said, extending her hand cautiously. "I'm Mrs. Hargrove, the caretaker here. It's unexpected to see you." Grayson shook her hand, his grip firm but unsure. "I came to see the orphanage," he said. Charlie's letter caught my attention. Mrs. Hargrove raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, I hope it's given you some insight into what we're facing. These children deserve better than this, but we're doing the best we can with what we have." Grayson nodded, his mind racing. He had spent years avoiding situations like this, distancing himself from anything that might force him to confront the harsher realities of life. But now, standing in this room with Charlie and Mrs. Hargrove, he felt something shift. That evening, Grayson returned to his mansion, the orphanage lingering in his thoughts. He sat in his study, staring at the letter Charlie had written, now smoothed out and resting on his desk. The boy's words echoed in his mind, "Even if you don't help, I will keep trying." Grayson poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light. He sipped it slowly, his gaze distant. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to shut out the world's problems. Charity, to him, had always been a transactional act, a way to bolster his reputation rather than a genuine gesture of goodwill. But Charlie's determination and resilience had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. The next morning, Grayson called his assistant, Margaret, into his office. She was a no-nonsense woman who had worked for him for years, accustomed to his demanding nature. "Margaret," Grayson said, his tone unusually subdued, "I want you to draft a proposal for funding renovations at the Willow Street Orphanage." Margaret blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "The orphanage? Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," Grayson said firmly. "But keep it anonymous. I don't want my name attached to it." Margaret nodded, though her curiosity was evident. "I'll get started on it right away." A week later, construction crews arrived at the orphanage, their trucks filled with supplies. The children watched in awe as workers began repairing the roof, replacing broken windows, and painting the walls. Mrs. Hargrove was speechless when she received the news, her eyes welling with tears. Charlie, however, was skeptical. "Why would someone help us and not tell us who they are?" he asked Mrs. Hargrove as they watched the renovations progress. "Maybe they just wanted to do something good," she replied, though she too wondered about the mystery donor. Despite his reservations, Charlie couldn't hide his excitement as the orphanage transformed before his eyes. The once crumbling building became a bright and welcoming space, complete with new furniture, books, and even a small playground. One afternoon, as Charlie sat under a tree in the yard, flipping through one of the new books, he spotted a familiar figure standing by the gate. It was Grayson, his suit impeccable as always but his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Mr. Grayson?" Charlie called out, standing up and walking toward him. Grayson cleared his throat, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I came to see how things are going." Charlie crossed his arms, his brow furrowing. "Was it you? Did you do all this?" Grayson hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. But I didn't want anyone to know." "Why?" Charlie asked, his tone a mix of confusion and curiosity. Grayson sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Because I wasn't sure I deserved the credit. This wasn't about me, it was about you and the other kids. You deserved better." Charlie studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. Not just for the orphanage but for listening to my letter. It means a lot." Grayson felt a lump rise in his throat, the boy's gratitude striking a chord deep within him. He nodded, unable to find the right words. Over the next few weeks, Grayson found himself returning to the orphanage more frequently. At first, he told himself it was to oversee the renovations, but as time went on, he realized it was more than that. He enjoyed spending time with the children, listening to their stories and watching their unbridled joy as they played in the newly renovated yard. One day, as he sat on a bench watching Charlie and Robbie kick a soccer ball back and forth, Mrs. Hargrove joined him, a cup of tea in her hand. "I have to admit," she said, her tone light, "I never thought I'd see Edmund Grayson sitting here, surrounded by children." Grayson chuckled softly. "Neither did I. You've made a real difference here," she continued, her voice sincere. "These kids will remember this for the rest of their lives." Grayson looked down, his expression thoughtful. "I think they've made more of a difference in my life than I have in theirs." Mrs. Hargrove smiled, her gaze warm. "That's the thing about kindness. It changes everyone involved." The transformation in Grayson didn't go unnoticed. His staff remarked on the change in his demeanor. He was less abrupt, more patient. Even his business partners were surprised by his newfound interest in philanthropy, though they didn't question it. But for Grayson, the most meaningful change was the connection he had formed with Charlie and the other children. They had shown him a world he had spent years shutting out, a world filled with challenges but also with hope and resilience. One evening, as Grayson prepared to leave the orphanage, Charlie ran up to him, holding out a piece of paper. "I wrote you another letter," he said, grinning. Grayson unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the boy's neat handwriting. The letter was simple but heartfelt, thanking Grayson for his kindness and for showing the children that people could change. As Grayson read the letter, he felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions. Not just guilt or regret, but gratitude and hope. He looked at Charlie, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Charlie, for reminding me of what truly matters." Charlie beamed, his face glowing with pride. "You're welcome, Mr. Grayson. And thank you for believing in us." As Grayson walked away that night, the letter tucked safely in his pocket, he knew his life had changed forever. The boy's courage and determination had opened his heart in a way he hadn't thought possible, leaving him a better man than he had ever been. Grayson returned to his office the next day, but his mind was elsewhere. The bustling city outside his towering glass building seemed distant, almost irrelevant. For years, he had been consumed by numbers, profits, and power, but now, all he could think about was the orphanage and the children who had become a part of his life. Charlie's second letter was still in his pocket, the words etched into his heart. As he sat at his desk, Margaret entered with a stack of documents, her usual brisk efficiency on display. "These are the quarterly reports, sir," she said, placing them in front of him. "And the board is expecting your approval on the merger proposal." Grayson glanced at the papers but didn't reach for them. Instead, he looked up at Margaret. "Do you ever think about the impact of what we do here?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "The impact, sir?" "Yes," Grayson said, leaning back in his chair. "We generate millions of dollars, acquire companies, and expand our influence. But do we ever stop to think about how that affects the people who aren't in this office?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I suppose it's not something we usually focus on." Grayson nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time we did." Later that week, Grayson called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The board members filed into the sleek conference room, their curiosity piqued. Grayson stood at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence softened by a newfound resolve. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his voice steady but uncharacteristically reflective. "About this company, about what we've built, and about what we've overlooked." The board members exchanged glances, unsure of where this was going. "For years, we've focused on growth and profits," Grayson continued. "But what if we started focusing on something more? What if we used our resources to create meaningful change, not just for our shareholders, but for the communities we touch?" One of the board members, a gray-haired man named Richard, frowned. "With all due respect, Edmund, our responsibility is to the shareholders. Philanthropy is admirable, but it's not our primary goal." Grayson met Richard's gaze, his expression firm. "I used to think that too. But I've seen firsthand how much of a difference we can make when we choose to care. There's more to life than balance sheets and dividends." Another board member, a younger woman named Claire, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" Grayson took a deep breath. "I want to establish a corporate foundation. A portion of our profits will be allocated to community projects, renovating schools, funding orphanages, providing scholarships. It's time we gave something back." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, Margaret, who had been standing by the door, spoke up. "It's bold," she said, "but it's the right thing to do." The creation of the Grayson Foundation was announced a month later. The news made headlines, with journalists praising the billionaire's sudden shift toward philanthropy. But for Grayson, it wasn't about the publicity. It was about keeping the promise he had made to himself and to the children at the orphanage. Charlie, of course, was thrilled when he heard the news. "Does this mean you'll help more kids like us?" he asked one afternoon as he and Grayson sat under the tree in the orphanage yard. "That's the plan," Grayson said, smiling. "But I'll need your help, Charlie. You've got a knack for inspiring people." Charlie grinned. "I'll do my best, Mr. Grayson." As the foundation's work began, Grayson found himself busier than ever. He visited schools, community centers, and shelters, listening to the stories of people who had been overlooked by society. Each visit deepened his understanding of the challenges they faced and strengthened his commitment to making a difference. But his connection to the orphanage remained special. He often returned to check on Charlie and the other children, bringing supplies, organizing events, and even joining in their soccer games. The once intimidating businessman had become a beloved figure among the children, their laughter and joy a constant reminder of the power of compassion. One evening, as Grayson was leaving the orphanage, Mrs. Hargrove stopped him at the gate. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she said, her tone serious. "What is it?" Grayson asked. "It's about Charlie," she said. "He's been talking about starting a program here, a way to help other orphans write letters to people who can make a difference, just like he did." Grayson's eyes widened. "That's incredible." Mrs. Hargrove nodded. "He said you inspired him. He wants to give other kids the courage to speak up, to ask for help." Grayson felt a lump rise in his throat. "He's an extraordinary boy." "He is," Mrs. Hargrove agreed. "And he's lucky to have you in his corner." The letter-writing program, called Voices of Hope, quickly became a cornerstone of the orphanage. With Grayson's support, the children were provided with writing supplies and taught how to articulate their dreams and needs. The program connected them with mentors, sponsors, and community leaders, creating a network of support that extended far beyond the walls of the orphanage. Charlie took great pride in the program, often helping the younger children craft their letters. "It's not just about asking for things," he told Grayson one day. "It's about believing that our voices matter." Grayson smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "You're teaching them something powerful, Charlie. Never forget that." Years passed, and the impact of the Grayson Foundation and the Voices of Hope program continued to grow. The orphanage became a model for others across the country, its success inspiring similar initiatives in other cities. Charlie, now a young man, had become a leader in his own right, running the program and mentoring the next generation of children. One crisp autumn afternoon, the orphanage held a special event to celebrate the 10th anniversary of its transformation. The yard was filled with familiar faces, former residents who had grown up and returned to share their stories, community leaders who had supported the orphanage, and families whose lives had been changed by its work. Grayson, now retired from his business empire, stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had traded his tailored suits for a simple sweater and slacks, his once sharp demeanor softened by years of service and connection. Charlie approached him, his smile as bright as ever. "You made it," he said. "Of course," Grayson replied. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." They stood together, watching as the younger children played on the playground and the older ones shared their stories with the crowd. It was a scene of hope and joy, a testament to how much had been accomplished. "You know," Charlie said, his voice thoughtful, "none of this would have happened without you." Grayson shook his head. "You give me too much credit, Charlie. This was your dream. I just helped it along." Charlie smiled, his gaze steady. "Maybe, but you showed me that people can change. And that's something I'll never forget." Grayson felt his throat tighten, his eyes misting with emotion. "Thank you, Charlie, for believing in me when I didn't deserve it." As the sun began to set, casting the yard in a warm golden light, the two of them stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. The journey that had begun with a simple letter had transformed both of their lives, proving that even the smallest act of courage could spark a legacy of change. And in that moment, surrounded by the laughter of children and the warmth of a community, Edmund Grayson knew that he had finally found what truly mattered. The evening event at the orphanage spilled into the twilight hours. Twinkling lights hung from the trees, casting a soft glow over the yard where families, volunteers, and former orphans celebrated. Grayson stood near one of the tables, quietly observing the joyful scene. Though he tried to stay in the background, people constantly approached him to express their gratitude. "Mr. Grayson, you've changed lives here," a young woman said, her voice tinged with emotion. She introduced herself as Elena, one of the orphanage's first residents to benefit from the renovations and programs. Now a teacher, she had returned to honor the place that had shaped her future. Grayson smiled warmly, shaking her hand. "It's good to meet you, Elena, but I can't take all the credit. This place is a testament to everyone's hard work, yours included." Elena beamed, her confidence shining through. "Even so, you were the first person to believe in us. That means more than you'll ever know." Grayson nodded, her words lingering in his mind as she walked away. The gratitude was humbling, but it also reminded him of the responsibility he carried. This wasn't just about the past, it was about ensuring the work continued long into the future. Later that evening, Grayson found Charlie sitting under their usual tree, a notebook in his lap. Despite the festivities around him, the young man seemed deep in thought, his brow furrowed as he scribbled notes. "What are you working on?" Grayson asked, sitting down beside him. Charlie looked up, startled for a moment before smiling. "Just some ideas for the program. I was thinking, what if we expanded Voices of Hope to other orphanages? We could teach kids everywhere how to speak up and connect with people who can help." Grayson leaned back, impressed by Charlie's ambition. "That's a big idea. Do you think you're ready for it?" Charlie nodded, his expression determined. "I do. I've learned so much here, but I know there are kids out there who need the same opportunities. They just need someone to believe in them." Grayson smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Then let's make it happen. You've got my full support." The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and preparation as Voices of Hope prepared to expand nationally. Charlie, now in his early 20s, took charge of the initiative, working closely with Grayson and a team of volunteers to establish partnerships with orphanages across the country. Their first stop was a small orphanage in a rural town, where conditions were eerily similar to what Charlie had experienced as a child. The building was crumbling, resources were scarce, and the children seemed withdrawn, their spirits dulled by years of neglect. Charlie gathered the children in the yard, sitting cross-legged among them as he shared his story. "When I was your age, I lived in an orphanage just like this one," he began. "It was hard, and sometimes I felt like no one cared. But then I wrote a letter, a simple letter asking for help. And you know what? It changed everything." The children listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity and hope. Charlie held up a blank piece of paper. "This is where it starts. Write down your dreams, your needs, or even just your thoughts. Your voice matters, and we're here to make sure it's heard." By the end of the day, the children had written dozens of letters, each one a glimpse into their hearts. Some asked for basic necessities like shoes and school supplies, while others dreamed of becoming artists, doctors, or athletes. Charlie carefully collected the letters, promising to deliver them to people who could help. Grayson watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride as he saw how naturally Charlie inspired the children. It was a reminder of how far they had both come and how much they still had to do. The expansion of Voices of Hope brought new challenges and opportunities. As the program grew, so did its impact. Letters poured in from orphanages across the country, each one a testament to the power of giving children a voice. Volunteers worked tirelessly to match the letters with sponsors, mentors, and resources, creating a network of support that changed lives. One letter, in particular, caught Grayson's attention. It was from a boy named Luis, who dreamed of becoming an architect. In his letter, he described how he used scraps of cardboard and tape to build model houses, each one more intricate than the last. "I want to build homes where everyone feels safe and happy," Luis wrote. "Homes where no one feels alone." Grayson couldn't help but feel a connection to the boy's dream. He reached out to Luis personally, arranging to visit his orphanage and see his work firsthand. When he arrived, Luis shyly presented a model he had made. A tiny but detailed house complete with windows, doors, and even a garden. "This is incredible," Grayson said, his admiration genuine. "You've got a real talent, Luis." Luis beamed, his confidence growing. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Grayson replied. "And I'd like to help you develop that talent. How would you feel about joining a mentorship program with real architects? They can teach you everything you need to know." Luis's eyes widened, his hands trembling slightly as he held the model. "I'd love that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. From that day forward, Luis became one of Voices of Hope's success stories. With Grayson's support, he attended workshops, received art supplies, and eventually earned a scholarship to a prestigious architecture program. His journey became a symbol of what the program could achieve, inspiring others to believe in the power of dreams. Meanwhile, Grayson's own journey continued to evolve. Though he remained deeply involved in the foundation, he also found himself reflecting on his personal life. For years, he had kept people at arm's length, convinced that vulnerability was a weakness. But his connection with Charlie and the children had taught him otherwise. One evening, as he sat in his study reviewing letters from the program, Margaret entered with a stack of invitations. "These just arrived, sir," she said, placing them on his desk. "Charity galas, business dinners, the usual." Grayson glanced at the invitations but didn't reach for them. "Margaret," he said after a moment, "do you ever feel like you're missing something? Something important?" Margaret tilted her head, studying him carefully. "What do you mean?" "I mean, for so long, I've focused on my work, my achievements. But now, I wonder if I've neglected the things that really matter. Relationships, family, things I used to push aside." Margaret smiled softly. "It's never too late to build those things, Mr. Grayson. You've already started with the children at the orphanage. Maybe it's time to let more people into your life." Her words stayed with him long after she left the room. For the first time in years, Grayson allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by work alone, a future where he could be part of a community, a family. The years rolled on, and the impact of Voices of Hope grew exponentially. Charlie, now a confident young man in his late 20s, had become the face of the program, his story inspiring countless others to join the cause. Under his leadership, the program expanded internationally, connecting children in need with resources and opportunities around the world. Grayson, now in his 70s, continued to play an active role, though he had handed over much of the day-to-day work to Charlie and the Foundation's team. His once imposing demeanor had softened with age, replaced by a quiet wisdom and a deep sense of gratitude. One sunny afternoon, Grayson and Charlie stood together in the yard of the original orphanage, watching a group of children play. The orphanage had long since been transformed into a state-of-the-art facility, its walls painted bright and its grounds filled with laughter. "It's hard to believe it all started with a single letter," Charlie said, his voice filled with wonder. Grayson nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "That letter changed both of our lives, Charlie. It reminded me of what really matters." Charlie turned to him, his expression serious but warm. "You've given me so much, Mr. Grayson. Not just the support, but the belief that people can change, that they can become better. And you've shown me that it's never too late to start," Grayson replied, his voice thick with emotion. As they stood side by side, the sounds of laughter and joy surrounding them, Grayson felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had led him to this moment, a moment of connection, purpose, and love. And in that moment, he knew that his life, once defined by wealth and ambition, had found its true meaning in the simple act of giving back. A few years later, the Voices of Hope initiative was celebrating its 15th anniversary. It had become a global movement, supporting thousands of children and their dreams. The program's headquarters, located in the heart of the city, was buzzing with activity in preparation for a gala event. The event wasn't just a celebration, it was a chance to showcase the impact of the program and honor those who had made it possible. Charlie, now in his early 30s, was standing on the stage rehearsing his speech. The event was the biggest they'd ever hosted, with hundreds of supporters, donors, and program alumni set to attend. Charlie's success was no longer just about the orphanage he grew up in, it was about the countless lives he had touched along the way. Meanwhile, Edmund Grayson sat in the audience area, watching Charlie rehearse. Though his once imposing stature had softened with age, his presence still commanded respect. He no longer wore the sharp suits that had once defined him. Now, his attire reflected his humility, a simple blazer and slacks. But the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. "Do you think it's too long?" Charlie asked, glancing down at his note cards. Grayson shook his head. "It's perfect. Every word matters, just like every letter these kids write. You're telling their story, Charlie. Don't overthink it." Charlie smiled, taking comfort in Grayson's reassurance. Over the years, their bond had deepened, evolving from mentor and mentee to something closer to family. Charlie often referred to Grayson as a father figure, and Grayson quietly cherished the title, though he'd never admit it outright. That evening, the gala was in full swing. The grand hall sparkled with lights, and the room buzzed with conversations as attendees mingled, sharing stories of the program's impact. The walls were lined with displays featuring letters from children who had benefited from Voices of Hope, alongside photos of them achieving their dreams. One photo showed Luis, now a successful architect, standing in front of a school he had designed for underprivileged children. Another featured Elena, the teacher, surrounded by her students. Grayson walked through the displays, pausing to read the letters. Each one was a reminder of how far the program had come. As he stood in front of Luis's photo, a voice behind him said, "He talks about you all the time, you know." Grayson turned to see Luis himself, now in his 20s and exuding confidence. "Mr. Grayson," Luis said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you." Grayson shook his hand, a warm smile spreading across his face. "It's good to see you too, Luis. I'm proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you," Luis said. "But I wouldn't be here without you and Voices of Hope. That letter was the first time I felt like someone truly believed in me." Grayson nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "You believed in yourself, Luis. That's what mattered." The gala reached its pinnacle when Charlie took the stage to deliver his speech. The room fell silent as he began, his voice steady and filled with conviction. 15 years ago, I wrote a letter. I was just a boy then, scared, uncertain, and desperate for someone to listen. I didn't know if anyone would read it, let alone care. But someone did. That letter wasn't just words on a page, it was a lifeline, a chance to believe that my voice mattered. Charlie paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. Today, we celebrate thousands of letters, thousands of voices that have been heard. We celebrate the children who dared to dream and the people who helped make those dreams come true. He turned to Grayson, who was seated in the front row. And we celebrate the man who taught me that change is possible. Mr. Grayson, your belief in me changed my life. And your support has changed countless others. The audience erupted into applause, their standing ovation lasting long after Charlie finished speaking. Grayson, overwhelmed by the moment, wiped a tear from his eye. He had always been uncomfortable with praise, but this time he let it wash over him. It wasn't just about him, it was about the journey they had all taken together. After the gala, Grayson and Charlie found themselves standing on the balcony overlooking the city. The night air was crisp, and the distant hum of traffic provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "You've done something remarkable here," Grayson said, his voice filled with pride. "This program, it's bigger than anything I ever imagined." Charlie leaned against the railing, a thoughtful expression on his face. "None of it would have happened without you, Mr. Grayson. You showed me that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life." Grayson chuckled softly. "And you've shown me that even the hardest hearts can be softened." "Thank you for that, Charlie." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling over them. Finally, Charlie turned to Grayson with a grin. "So, what's next for you? Any plans to slow down?" Grayson smirked. "Retirement doesn't suit me. I may be stepping back, but I'll always be around to see what you're up to. Someone has to keep you in line." Charlie laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the years went on, Voices of Hope continued to thrive. New programs were introduced, including mentorship initiatives, educational grants, and career placement services for young adults aging out of orphanages. The program's reach extended to countries around the world, its mission transcending borders and cultures. Grayson, though now fully retired, remained a beloved figure within the organization. He often attended events, visited orphanages, and met with the children whose lives had been changed by the program. Though his health began to decline with age, his spirit remained as strong as ever. One day, as Grayson sat in his study at home, he received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed letter, the original letter Charlie had written to him all those years ago. Alongside it was a handwritten note from Charlie. "Dear Mr. Grayson, this letter started everything. It reminded me that my voice mattered and showed me the power of believing in others. I wanted you to have it as a reminder of the change you've created, not just in my life, but in the lives of so many. Thank you for being the person who listened. With gratitude, Charlie." Grayson stared at the letter for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. The memories came flooding back. The boy at his door, the laughter in the boardroom, the visit to the orphanage, and the transformation that followed. It was a journey he hadn't expected to take, but one that had given his life meaning in ways he couldn't have imagined. He placed the framed letter on the mantel, its presence a constant reminder of how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives and creating legacies. A year later, the Voices of Hope team hosted a special event to honor Grayson's contributions to the program. It was a small, intimate gathering, attended by Charlie, Mrs. Hargrove, and a handful of others who had been part of the journey from the beginning. As they sat around a table sharing stories and laughter, Grayson felt a deep sense of peace. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, only to discover that true fulfillment came from the connections he had made and the lives he had touched. That night, as he looked around the room at the people who had become his family, Grayson realized that his legacy wasn't in the wealth he had accumulated or the empire he had built. It was in the love, hope, and possibility he had helped create. And that, he thought, was the greatest success of all. The years continued to roll by, and Voices of Hope blossomed into a worldwide movement. It became more than a program. It became a symbol of what could be accomplished when one simple act of kindness sparked a cascade of change. Schools, orphanages, and even corporations partnered with the initiative, adopting its philosophy of giving voices to those who needed to be heard. At the heart of it all was Charlie, who had become the program's director and its most visible champion. His speeches, full of conviction and warmth, inspired people across continents. Yet, even as the world recognized him as a leader and changemaker, he never forgot where it all began, with a letter and the man who had chosen to read it. Grayson, now in his 80s, had largely stepped away from public life. Though his days of boardrooms and business deals were long behind him, his influence remained. He spent his time quietly supporting the program from the background, offering advice to Charlie and mentoring younger leaders within the organization. His health had begun to decline, a fact he accepted with a quiet dignity. Despite his frailty, he insisted on staying engaged with Voices of Hope, often making phone calls from the comfort of his home or reviewing letters that Charlie sent his way. One afternoon, as Grayson sat in his favorite armchair by the window, Charlie arrived with a surprise. He carried a carefully wrapped package and a bright smile that lit up the room. "Mr. Grayson," Charlie said, setting the package down on the coffee table. "I thought it was time to show you something special." Grayson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it?" Charlie carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a bound book. On the cover, in elegant gold lettering, were the words, "The letters that changed everything." Grayson's hands trembled as he reached for the book. Flipping through its pages, he found a collection of letters from children all over the world who had been helped by Voices of Hope. Each letter was paired with a photograph of the child who had written it, along with an update on where they were now. "This," Grayson began, his voice faltering. "This is extraordinary." Charlie sat beside him, his smile soft. "We wanted you to see the full impact of what you started. These letters, these lives, they wouldn't exist in this way without you." Grayson's eyes misted as he read through the letters. A young girl from India wrote about how she had been able to attend school and was now studying to become a doctor. A boy from South Africa shared his dream of opening a community center, inspired by the orphanage that had changed his life. Each letter was a testament to the ripple effect of a single choice. A choice Grayson had made all those years ago. He closed the book gently, his gaze meeting Charlie's. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." Charlie placed a hand on Grayson's shoulder. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." As the months passed, Grayson's health continued to decline, and he found himself reflecting more on his life. He often thought about his younger self, the cold, distant man who had dismissed a boy's letter as a foolish dream. It was almost difficult to reconcile that version of himself with the man he had become. But he didn't regret the journey. Every step, even the missteps, had led him to where he was now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the sky, Grayson sat on the porch of his home, watching the world slowly quiet around him. He held the book Charlie had given him, flipping through its pages once more. Each letter felt like a thread in a larger tapestry, weaving together a story of resilience, hope, and transformation. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Charlie, carrying a thermos and 2 mugs. "I thought you might like some tea," Charlie said, settling into the chair beside him. Grayson chuckled softly. "You've always had good timing." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the tea warming their hands as the cool evening air settled in. Finally, Grayson spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "Charlie, I've been thinking a lot about legacy." Charlie glanced at him, waiting for him to continue. "For so long, I thought legacy was about building something, an empire, a fortune, something tangible that people would remember me by," Grayson said. "But now, I realize it's about the lives we touch. The impact we have on others. That's the only legacy that truly matters." Charlie nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you've left a legacy that will outlive us all, Mr. Grayson. Voices of Hope is proof of that." Grayson smiled, though there was a tinge of sadness in his eyes. "It's not my legacy alone. It's yours too. And everyone else who believed in the power of a simple letter." A few weeks later, Charlie received a call from Margaret, who still worked as Grayson's assistant despite his retirement. Her voice was calm but tinged with sadness. "Charlie," she said softly, "Mr. Grayson passed away last night. Peacefully in his sleep." Charlie's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Though he had known this day was coming, the weight of the loss hit him harder than he expected. "Thank you for letting me know," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. In the days that followed, messages poured in from around the world, each one a tribute to the man who had transformed countless lives. The Voices of Hope community rallied together to honor Grayson's memory, sharing stories of how his kindness and vision had changed their lives. The memorial service was held at the original orphanage, the place where it had all begun. The yard was filled with people, former residents, program alumni, volunteers, and supporters, all gathered to celebrate Grayson's life. Photos and letters lined the walls, each one a reminder of the legacy he had left behind. Charlie stood at the front, addressing the crowd with a mixture of grief and gratitude. Edmund Grayson was more than a benefactor, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He was a mentor, a friend, and a father figure to so many of us. He taught us that it's never too late to change, to care, and to make a difference. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Mr. Grayson's greatest lesson was that every voice matters. Every letter, every dream, it all starts with someone who chooses to listen. And because of him, we've built something that will continue to change lives for generations to come. The crowd erupted into applause, their standing ovation a final tribute to the man who had inspired them all. In the weeks that followed, Charlie threw himself into his work, determined to honor Grayson's legacy by continuing to grow Voices of Hope. The program introduced new initiatives, including one named in Grayson's honor, the Edmund Grayson Fellowship, which provided mentorship and resources to young leaders working to make a difference in their communities. Though Grayson was no longer physically present, his spirit lived on in every letter, every success story, and every life the program touched. Charlie often found himself thinking of Grayson, especially during moments of doubt or difficulty. In those moments, he would reread the letter Grayson had written to him years ago, a letter of gratitude and encouragement that reminded him of the man who had changed his life. Years later, at the 25th anniversary of Voices of Hope, Charlie stood on a stage much like the one from the gala years before. The program had expanded to over 50 countries, its reach touching millions of lives. As he addressed the crowd, his voice filled with emotion, he spoke of the man who had started it all. Edmund Grayson believed in the power of hope and the strength of community, Charlie said. He showed us that it's never too late to rewrite your story. And because of him, we've built a movement that proves kindness can change the world. As the crowd erupted into applause, Charlie glanced at the framed letter sitting on the podium, the very letter he had written to Grayson as a boy. It was a reminder of how far they had come and a symbol of the legacy they had built together. And as the applause echoed through the hall, Charlie felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the seeds Grayson had planted would continue to grow, spreading hope and possibility for generations to come.